for all Americans. When I became president, one of the first things I did, I signed an executive order to advance equality and racial justice throughout our federal policies and all our institutions. That's because delivering the promise of America is not the work of one department. It has to be the business of the whole of the federal government. And today, I'm proud to report that more than 90 federal agencies, including every cabinet department, are releasing more than 300 concrete and intentional actions and commitments to address systematic barriers to prosperity, equality, opportunity, and dignity everywhere. You can review it all here at whitehouse.gov/equity. You'll find how agencies are taking ambitious action to protect the wages of hourly workers, eliminate the racial gap in home ownership, increase capital for small business, leverage federal contracting for minority-owned and women-owned small businesses, deliver environmental justice, reduce barriers to transportation, invest in higher education, improve maternal and child health, and so much more. The bottom line, advancing equity is not a one-year project. It's a generational commitment. These plans are an important step forward, reflecting the Biden-Harris administration's work to make the promise of America real for every American. And I mean every American. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this White House convening on equity. I'm Susan Rice, President Biden's domestic policy advisor. I have the responsibility and privilege of driving the president's domestic policy agenda in the White House and across the federal government, from healthcare to economic mobility to rural and urban policy. That includes quarterbacking our efforts to advance equity and racial justice. On President Biden's very first day in office, he signed a historic executive order, making equity and racial justice the business of the entire federal government. That had never been done before. But President Biden and Vice President Harris knew, like so many of us, that it was past time for us to live up to the ideal of equal opportunity at the core of American democracy. They also understood that equity goes to the heart of our success as a nation. When the typical Black family has just 1/8 the wealth of the typical white family, that corrodes our broader economy. When at least 35% of Americans in rural and tribal communities lack adequate high-speed internet that restricts growth and competitiveness well beyond rural America, we must reject a zero-sum mentality and recognize the reality, backed up by economic research, that a rising tide really does lift all boats. For the past 15 months, our administration has been hard at work doing just that. We passed the landmark American Rescue Plan, advancing an equitable response to the pandemic and cutting child poverty to record lows. Through the president's historic bipartisan infrastructure law, we're closing the digital divide, removing poisonous lead pipes, and creating good jobs in underserved communities, both rural and urban. We're working to tackle housing discrimination, to promote environmental justice and defend the sacred right to vote. Today, we're taking another important step towards a more equitable and just future. When President Biden signed that day one executive order, he directed each federal agency to develop an equity action plan, identifying the often invisible barriers that prevent their policies and programs from benefiting all Americans, and coming up with ways to address those obstacles. More than 90 agencies answered that call, from every major cabinet-level agency to smaller entities like the Export-Import Bank and the National Science Foundation. This was truly a whole-of-government endeavor. To learn more about the 300+ concrete strategies and commitments in these action plans, you can visit the new website we've launched today, whitehouse.gov/equity. And you'll hear more from our panelists shortly. But I'll note that the thoroughness and creativity reflected in these plans are impressive. The Pentagon is leveraging its vast procurement power to narrow the racial and gender wealth gaps and support small, disadvantaged businesses. The Environmental Protection Agency is revitalizing its focus on environmental justice for disadvantaged communities, shifting its civil rights enforcement from primarily responding to complaints to proactively initiating reviews. To address the maternal mortality crisis among Black and Native women, the Department of Health and Human Services is working with states to expand Medicaid postpartum coverage for a year after childbirth, a critical period in which nearly 12% of postpartum deaths occur. These plans also embed equity into the day-to-day work of the federal government, from making it easier to fill out forms and navigate websites, to the work our Equitable Data Working Group is doing to use demographic data to make better policy and deliver better results for the American people. Collectively, these equity action plans will grow federal investment and support in communities that have been locked out of opportunity for far too long. Communities of color, tribal and rural communities, LGBTQI+ communities, communities impacted by persistent poverty, people with disabilities, women and girls. This is transformative work, and I want to thank the agency leaders, those with us today and those who aren't, for prioritizing it. And I'm also grateful to the many advocates and stakeholders who consulted with us and pushed us to raise our ambitions. And I especially want to thank our White House team, particularly the staff of the Domestic Policy Council and the Office of Management and Budget, who carefully reviewed and offered detailed guidance on nearly 100 of these plans. Today is a day of progress, but we're not resting on our laurels. As President Biden said a year ago, and I quote, "We need to make equity and justice part of what we do today, tomorrow, and every day." The Biden-Harris administration is going to keep doing the hard, important work, and I have immense optimism that working together, inside and outside of government, we will bring the full promise of America closer for every American. And now it's my great privilege to introduce Shalonda Young, our Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rice. Just yesterday, I joined the ambassador along with the Vice President Harris and members of the Maternal Health Cabinet for a conversation on what this administration is doing on maternal health. That effort may never make the cover of the New York Times, but it will impact moms around this country, for moms of color, for rural moms, for Native American moms, and for their families. We talked about how caring and delivering a child is one of the most significant experiences in any mom's life, something I know a little bit about. People told me having a child was a life-changing event. I did not believe them. I believe them now. But right now, in this country, giving birth and raising a child is a different experience based on a mom's income and her race, her zip code. Her chances of surviving childbirth can be determined based on those factors. And that's what we mean when we talk about equity, because it shouldn't be like that in the United States of America. I want to highlight 3 key areas where OMB is implementing the Biden-Harris agenda to advance equity. OMB is here to be a partner to agencies on advancing equity. We recognize that this is a historic and first-of-its-kind effort, and that means building new muscle and adopting new approaches in the federal government. This requires engaging key stakeholders like you, as well as state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and how to advance equity through the federal government. OMB put out a public report to the president. We've shared resources we collected online, and we created an equity learning community to support agencies as they develop their equity action plans. Last month, we put out the president's fiscal year 2023 budget, and it makes critical investments in equity. There's an entire 11-page fact sheet I won't go over with you today. You can find it online, and we'll certainly hear more from agency leaders here today. But I want to give a few highlights from agencies not represented here today, because this really is a whole of government approach. You heard the president say that. This budget will upgrade drinking water and wastewater infrastructure in communities that are often overlooked. And it proposes $111 million for DOT's Thriving Communities program to help disadvantaged communities advance transformative and climate-friendly infrastructure projects. It will double the maximum Pell Grant Award. These grants help nearly 60% of Black students, almost half of Latino students, and half of Native students put themselves through college. It would also more than double Title I funding to help under-resourced schools, which disproportionately serve students of color. The budget proposes historic new investments in child welfare reforms that will reduce the overrepresentation of children of color in foster care. While 1 in 17 children spend part of their childhood in foster care, that number is 1 in 9 for Black children and 1 in 7 for Native Americans. And this budget will reinvigorate federal civil rights enforcement to support police reform, prosecuting hate crimes, enforcing voting rights, and more. OMB is working to improve the delivery of federal services for all Americans. We're doing this in part by focusing on life experiences, how people actually live their lives. Families should not have to navigate a tangled web of government websites, offices, and phone numbers to access the services they depend on. Parents don't care whether a program is ultimately run by HHS, USDA, Labor, or HUD. They just want to get the help they need for their families. That's why OMB has provided funding and talent from teams like the U.S. Digital Service to support projects focusing on delivering services better for the people that we serve. And just yesterday, we announced that we are taking on the paperwork and long lines and the endless documents that people face when they want to access government programs. Again, this may not make the cover of the New York Times, but it's critically important to people, especially those underserved by their government. This is part of a broader effort led by President Biden to support better customer service to the American people, including communities that are often underserved. All too often, the people who need help the most have the hardest time getting it, and that's what we're looking to change. Achieving equity is a generational undertaking. This is not a problem that can be solved tomorrow, and certainly not in 1 year. But we're committed to doing the work and doing it so that it lasts longer than any of us around this table and these screens are here for. This is ambitious work, and we can't do it alone. We need you. We want to learn from you. So thank you for your partnership. Thank you for pushing us, for holding us accountable, and for being a part of this critical work. I look forward to today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Shalonda. I'm excited now to introduce 6 members of the President's Cabinet who today have released equity action plans that are ambitious but achievable. These plans together will advance health equity and economic justice, increase the investments in minority-owned businesses, strengthen the federal government's partnership with tribal nations and rural communities, and improve the diversity and vibrancy of neighborhoods across America. Federal agencies have just completed an historic 1-year journey to comprehensively assess, for the first time ever, how their key policies and programs may perpetuate the systemic barriers that underserved communities face. Sometimes these barriers are the result of exclusionary policies that the federal government actually promoted in decades past. Each of your agencies has announced new commitments to improve outcomes for underserved communities. We'd like to start by hearing from each of you about what equity means as you deliver your agency's mission. How is your agency working to identify and overcome barriers to equity, including past discrimination? And what are 2 key actions you've committed to in the action plans released today? I'd like to turn first to Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rice. Appreciate that very kind introduction and for everything you're doing to address equity and inclusion in the Biden-Harris administration. It's an immense pleasure to be on a call with so many folks focused on ensuring every community has a voice in the policies we create. At Interior, we weave equity and inclusion into everything we do, from creating good-paying jobs and a clean energy economy and taking care of our land, air, and waters, to carving a path toward environmental justice and ensuring that underserved communities can access and benefit from their access to nature. Today, I am so proud to join my fellow cabinet secretaries in putting forward our equity action plans. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to addressing racial inequity and understands that past injustices and marginalization contribute to the disparities that we continually see today. Communities of color and poor communities have borne the burdens of environmental injustice, and many times they get left behind when disaster strikes. We have a long road ahead, but our equity action plans are our pledge to right those wrongs. At Interior, we acknowledge that the agency has not always used a lens of equity when accomplishing our mission. Much of America's history is tied to our public lands, but those lands, the jobs they create, the benefits of nature they provide, have not always been accessible to everyone. Our national parks, monuments, wildlife refuges, and other historic and culturally significant areas have played a major role in shaping America's identity. But we heard during listening sessions and through public comments that access to nature and public lands can be challenging for many people. It's something that I experienced firsthand when I would plan trips for my mom, who used a wheelchair for the last part of her life. We would always have to check if there was an elevator or a ramp that we could use, or even if it would be possible to park near an entrance. While we work to expand access to green space, education, and outdoor recreation for Americans living in and around cities and near many of our most iconic parks are located well away from urban centers and are not particularly accessible to many communities of color. We know that some underserved communities are underrepresented as visitors to public lands. This is exacerbated in low-income urban communities and for persons with disabilities. And even if they can get to the visitor center, some folks may face more barriers to exploring because of lack of transportation options on site, cost limitations, or accessibility barriers. And so we have a path ahead. We're investing in urban wildlife refuges and other spaces that are free to everyone. We're working with Secretary Buttigieg and the Department of Transportation to increase bus routes and other public transportation options serving our parks and other public lands. We're also partnering to offer free or low-cost experiences that introduce people to the outdoors and to understand what other limitations underserved communities and people with disabilities face. And whenever we can, we're expanding the universe of voices who can share their perspectives on access to the outdoors. We're making sure that diverse voices are at the decision-making table because we know that unique life experiences can shed light on new opportunities. Through this work and other important steps in our Equity Action Plan, Interior is reinforcing our commitment to fostering diversity and equity in all that we do. I look so forward to hearing from my fellow cabinet secretaries today about the truly inspirational work they're doing to weave equity into the fabric of our government service. And thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you so much, Secretary Haaland. Let's hear next from our Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Marcia Fudge. Secretary Fudge, HUD is leading vital work to address the persistent racial gaps in home ownership and to advance the promise of our nation's civil rights laws. What does equity mean for HUD?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rice, as well as Director Young. It's a pleasure to be with you all today and my colleagues. Today is certainly an important milestone in delivering on the President's commitment to advance racial equity. For HUD, racial equity is what we do each day in our mission to provide underserved communities with safe, affordable, and stable housing. Racial equity is and must continue to be front and center. I'm proud of the work that our team has done to develop this action plan. Our equity working group included HUD staff from every office, from headquarters to the field, from staff who have worked at HUD for decades to staff who have just arrived. In total, over 100 staff participated in the HUD Equity Working Group. Our challenge was choosing which of our many programs should be the focus on the Equity Action Plan because all of our programs must be examined through a lens of equity and advancing racial justice. HUD chose reducing the racial home ownership gap and improving equity in the delivery of services to people experiencing homelessness. While it is hard to lift up just one area, I admit, I know we have got a lot of ground to cover, so I will highlight here our work on home ownership. As you and the President have previously stated, we must address a history of racial discrimination in federal programs supporting home ownership. It has been more than 50 years since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. Today, the gap between Black and white homeowners is wider than it was in 1968. Given HUD and the Federal Housing Administration's reparative role in supporting first-time home buyers, many of whom are Black and brown, we are doing what we can to address the racial home ownership gap and unlock generational wealth building for those who have been locked out of opportunity for far too long. HUD's Equity Action Plan puts eliminating the racial home ownership gap front and center. For example, many of you saw that in March, we published the Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, PAVE, Madam Co-Chair. We published our action plan to combat bias in the housing market. This plan gets to the heart of where someone lives and what someone looks like, impacting their prosperity and wealth. Because the fact is that Black people and Latino people lose billions of dollars in equity and wealth just for being Black and brown. HUD recently announced our new senior advisor for racial equity, who comes to us with vast experience and will help lead this work throughout our agency. Equity is infused throughout what HUD does. We will continue to be on the forefront of this issue, whether executing on the 4 areas highlighted in our plan or in delivering our mission to ensure everyone has an affordable, healthy, safe place to live. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Fudge, for your historic work at HUD. I'd like to turn now to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Javier Becerra. Secretary, one of the places where inequities remain most profound in our nation is in health outcomes and access to health care. Tell us how HHS is advancing equity.
Ambassador Rice, thank you, and good morning to everyone. Let me begin, if I may, by thanking President Biden, Vice President Harris, Ambassador Yu, and the folks at the Domestic Policy Council for continuing to make equity a priority. We at HHS treat advancing equity not just as a job, but our mission here at the department. And we want to make sure that people understand everything we're going to do through our Equity Action Plan to make that a reality. So I'm going to go ahead and mention a few of those things because it is important that people know what we're doing here at HHS. Highlights, well, civil rights has to be part of that. We want to make sure that we're ensuring people's rights to care, that those rights are protected, including the rights of the disability community and LGBTQI Americans. Language access, we want to make sure that regardless of where you came from, what language you speak, you can still get the care that you need. Contracting and grants. We want to make sure that more businesses, organizations, and partners that have built trust in the communities that serve those most in need can be the vehicle for HHS funding and services so that we reach people that need it most. Capacity building. We're going to make sure that we're working to make sure our staff can access and shape programs so that they are best and ready to serve everyone. And finally, special focus on maternal mortality. Because here there's a clear area where we know there are stark disparities in America, the richest country in the world, that can destroy families. Those disparities often leave a child without a mother or a mother without a child. And we know that we can do a great deal, but we know specifically that in certain communities, our Black and our Alaska Native American Indian communities, the suffering is hardest. So we are taking on this challenge to make it a better life for all families. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure equity is always a focus. We know that a service can help people if it reaches them where they are. We're not going to wait for folks to come to us. We're going to go to them to provide them what services we offer. That's why we focus so much of our plan on breaking down barriers and getting services to healthcare services to people in their communities. Maternal mortality will give us a clear way to show that we can make a difference. We know that there are significantly higher rates of death in some of our particular communities. And so we're really going to zoom in on that as much as we can. So we're going to address this crisis by working with states to extend health insurance coverage in Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program. We're going to make sure we extend postpartum care for a new family from 60 days for that mother and baby to 365 days, a full year of coverage. We have a lot of work to do, we know that, but through these kinds of meetings, through the work and these action plans that we're putting forward, we think we can get it done, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Becerra. Equity entails delivering for all underserved communities and communities that the federal government has, in many respects, left behind, which very much deliberately includes rural America. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, to talk about the many good programs and efforts that USDA has underway in the equity space. Mr. Secretary.
Madam Ambassador, thank you very much for your leadership in this effort. And I want to also acknowledge the work of Director Young and her team at OMB that has allowed us to get to this point today. Look, I think we're all well aware of the history of USDA, which for far too long continued to be one of discrimination, disinvestment, exclusion, and denied opportunity. Efforts were undertaken during the Obama-Biden administration to write a new history for USDA, but President Biden's executive order allows us to continue that effort and to engage in a deeper and more comprehensive effort. And we are looking forward to accepting that challenge. At USDA, we base our equity effort on 4 very significant pillars. The first pillar is the establishment of an equity commission, co-chaired by Dr. Jewel Bernal, the first African-American deputy at the United States Department of Agriculture, and Arturo Rodriguez, former president of the United Farm Workers Union. 15-member commission taking a very specific and very deep dive look at USDA in an effort to try to determine what systemic barriers still exist with reference to our programs and the availability of those programs, and to make recommendations to root out those systemic barriers that do exist. And we look forward to the recommendations from that commission coming this year. The second pillar is an internal commitment at USDA to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. We have the most diverse senior leadership team in the history of the department, and each of those individuals is committed to making USDA a great place to work with a culture that puts equity in front of everything we do at USDA. The third pillar is our program equity pillar, governed by an extensive equity action plans that have been put forward by 20 mission areas within USDA. They've identified 525 specific actions that we intend to hold ourselves accountable in order to advance equity at USDA. Let me establish for the benefit of those who are watching this today, a number of priority areas at USDA where we're going to have a particular focus. We know we have to expand access to our programs, and access requires meaningful access through the establishment of technical assistance grants so that people understand and appreciate where our programs are and how best to apply for them. We've already issued 128 grants to expand technical access to underserved communities and populations. We look to remove barriers to qualifying for participation in our programs. The match requirement oftentimes in our grant programs makes it more difficult for underserved populations to participate. We want to make a fuller use of our nutrition programs, especially our WIC program, where we only have a 50% participation rate, and we know that women of color are disproportionately excluded from this program. We want to expand investment in persistent poverty counties where 21 million Americans live, 60% of whom are people of color. We want to advance the Justice 40 initiative as we do so. We want to use the power of our procurement at USDA to open up opportunities to small and historically underserved businesses that have never been able to do business with USDA. We want to hold ourselves accountable for civil rights compliance, and we want to strengthen our trust and treaty obligations with tribal nations. And the last pillar is, in fact, those last 2 items, civil rights compliance and strengthening our trust and treaty obligations with Native American tribes. We're excited about this opportunity. We are committed to it, and we believe that at the end of the day, USDA will be able to write that new and more progressive chapter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Vilsack. I'd now like to turn it over to Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo. Madam Secretary, commerce has such important influence over the growth of our nation's economy and the health of our businesses. I'd love to hear how commerce is advancing our equity agenda.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador Rice. It's fantastic for me to be with all of you this morning, and I think it's important that the Commerce Department is included in this discussion, because the truth of it is, inclusive growth is good for our economy. It's not only the right thing to do, but it will spur economic growth, because our diversity is America's competitive advantage. Homogeneity is the enemy of innovation and growth. And if we want to truly, compete on the global stage, then we must give everyone in America an opportunity to participate in the economy and to fulfill their potential and to fully participate. So here at the Commerce Department, I am very focused on driving and enhancing U.S. competitiveness. And in order to do that, it is essential to make sure that our prosperity is broadly shared. And that has not always been the case. So for that reason, I am particularly grateful for the leadership of President Biden, Vice President Harris, Ambassador Rice, Director Young on this issue. I think it couldn't be more important. In recognition of the fact that we at the Commerce Department and we in this administration believe so much in inclusivity, we recently changed the Department of Commerce's mission statement, because I believe firmly that you have to set the tone at the top if you want the work throughout the department to go in the right direction. Previously, our mission statement was, quote, to create the conditions for economic growth and opportunity. Now, as of a month ago, our mission is to create the conditions for economic growth and opportunity for all communities. And that really means all communities. So to that end, we're expanding outreach to ensure that underserved communities benefit from our existing programs. And on top of that, we're also rethinking these programs and our policies to ensure that they meet the needs of underserved and unserved communities. Our Equity Action Plan prioritizes 6 goals. First, and Ambassador Rice mentioned this, first, closing the digital divide through our broadband programs once and for all. Every single American, every American deserves access to high-speed, affordable internet. Second, ensuring community development dollars advance racial equity and support underserved communities. For too long, they haven't, and it's time to change that. Third, grow minority-owned businesses, and I'll talk in a second about MBDA. Fourth, strengthen small businesses in underserved communities by helping them access export markets. We know that businesses that export grow faster, are more profitable, and hire more. Small businesses, particularly women and minority-owned, don't export. And it's our job to make sure that they do, and they can, and they know how, and have support. Fifth, increasing access to the patent and trademark systems for inventors and entrepreneurs from historically underserved communities. And finally, make the Department of Commerce science and data more findable, accessible, and usable. Today, in the interest of time, I just want to specifically focus on our implementation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act programs. As you all know, the infrastructure law has sent to the Department of Commerce almost $50 billion in order to close the digital divide by providing every American with broadband. And very soon, in May, in just about a month, we're going to be releasing our big notice of funding opportunity for this initiative. And that means rural households, African-American households, households on tribal lands, who are now less likely to have home access to broadband, it's on us to make sure that they have access to broadband. So we're going to be providing states and territories with funds to develop and implement 5-year broadband action plans to close the digital divide. And these plans have to address local and community needs and identify those areas that need to be prioritized for federal broadband investment. And we are deadly serious about this. We are not going to send a penny out the door unless we are convinced that that plan is going to deliver broadband to everybody. Everybody. 50% of people on tribal lands now do not have access to broadband. 30% of people in rural America do not have access to broadband. Shame on us, and let's make sure we change that. Additionally, the infrastructure law permanently authorized the Minority Business Development Agency, MBDA, and we are now making huge progress on our efforts to grow the revenue of minority business enterprises here in the United States. We know that growing minority business enterprises, MBEs, can reduce the racial wealth gap, increase employment and opportunity in majority minority communities, and increase U.S. economic competitiveness. Excitingly, the MBDA is going to issue several funding opportunities in the next month, including one to expand MBDA's business center network to new states. And I'm very excited about this. So our equity plan tackles enormous challenges. And this is challenging work, but it's work that we have to do. And I would just end by saying, I feel very grateful to work on a team that cares deeply about this. And as I say, I'm grateful for your leadership, Susan, for leading from the White House. But as I look around this Zoom, I couldn't be luckier. You know, Tom and Deb and I are working on broadband. Secretary Fudge and I are working on affordable housing. We're working very closely with Administrator Guzman on the MBDA work with MBEs, and that's what it's going to take, an entire team, administration-wide approach driven by President Biden, and we will be able to deliver these results to close the equity gap.
Thank you very much, Secretary Raimondo. And finally, let's turn to the Administrator of Small Business, Isabel Guzman, to talk about all that the SBA is doing for historically disadvantaged communities.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rice, for your leadership on President Biden and Vice President Harris's equity agenda, which is really a driving force forward, and Director Young as well for lifting equity as a priority. It's a pleasure to be here with my cabinet colleagues as well and to hear about their great initiatives and continue to find ways to partner to lift the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to equity and our work at the SBA. Entrepreneurship, as we know, has long been a pathway for more Americans to achieve generational wealth building. And today, that entrepreneurial spirit is stronger than ever. Thanks to continued support through the American Rescue Plan, we've helped small businesses survive with COVID relief. New business applications are up 30% over pre-pandemic levels, and women and people of color are starting businesses at the highest rate. It's a pivotal moment to finally address the capital gaps and opportunity gaps that hold back too many of our underserved entrepreneurs, who are the majority of these new businesses starting. The SBA is committed to equitably delivering the American dream of business ownership to more Americans. Equity is our North Star, and our core programs address those gaps directly with our small business lending and investments, our support networks, which help businesses level up their skills and gain market access to grow their revenues. And with the Equity Action Plan we're announcing today, the SBA is committing to progress on equity. First and foremost, we know connection is key for success in entrepreneurship, and we are building community partnerships to ensure all of our entrepreneurs are connected to resources. We launched the ARP-supported Community Navigators pilot program, and we'll be focused on empowering our new trusted, authentic network of 51 hub partners and more than 440 local spoke partners to build bridges to underserved communities, making sure they are connected to our district office centers and program offices across the country. And we will strengthen how we will increase access to this new network. We've elevated our Office of Native American Affairs and our Office of Women's Business Ownership and launched our Council on Underserved Communities that is meeting regularly to address all these policy areas with the SBA. And we're focused on strengthening our Women's Business Center network, which is now the largest network in our agency's history, now in every state in Puerto Rico, and we've doubled the number of centers at HBCUs and MSIs. And we will scale up business counseling, training, and other services to ensure equity and that we are delivering for the changing face of entrepreneurship. Secondly, access to capital is really vital for entrepreneurial success. With Vice President Harris, we announced just a couple of weeks ago an extension and key reforms in our Community Advantage Loan Program, and we will focus on expanding the program, which will help our mission-based lenders, those community development financial institutions and community development corporations, get more flexible capital to underserved small businesses. Expect new CDFIs in our network in the coming months as we grow this important program. And we will further expand access to capital across our entire portfolio, focusing on simple products to meet businesses where they are and with technology and wider distribution networks. The third area is really revenue growth. It's also very key for our small businesses, and we want to open doors, for example, to government contracting, especially growing the supply chain with small disadvantaged businesses, as well as those participating in all of our socioeconomic programs for women, veterans, and socially economically disadvantaged businesses. We recently opened more government contracting opportunities for small businesses, including women and other socioeconomic firms, with a 70% expansion of industries that women-owned small businesses can compete in for sole sourcing, and an expansion of 229 government small business size standards across 16 sectors, including the industries that will leverage opportunities in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So we need to get to work, and we're committed to making sure that contracting opportunities are available to more. We want to ensure that they can all leverage these new opportunities to build revenues within their businesses and expand. And finally, an area that the SBA is committed to participating in is the disaster assistance and support. We're expanding our disaster assistance, emphasizing preparedness, resilience, and mitigation, especially in the face of climate change and its impact on underserved communities. You know, we recognize that there's a lot of work to do across our programs to make sure that we are really truly meeting businesses where they are and in that changing face of entrepreneurship. Some of these changes are made with the stroke of a pen, but others are structural, and we will take more time to implement. But we know that with commitment and the partnerships that we've established and the work that we've done to date, we're going to work to transform our programs for equity in American entrepreneurship. And I really look forward to the continued leadership of President Biden and Vice President Harris as we charge forward on these issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for those highlights. I'm extra excited after listening to your many updates to continue the conversation. I have a question for Secretary Fudge and Secretary Becerra. One of the key elements of agency equity action plans has been the recognition that far too many Americans continue to face significant intergenerational poverty. The zip codes we grow up in have a lifelong impact on our health and our economic security. We heard from Secretary Fudge on HUD's commitment to addressing disparities in home ownership, Secretary Becerra, HHS's role in bringing down maternal mortality and morbidity. Can you speak to how your equity action plan specifically ensure that a family's background or the neighborhood someone grew up in doesn't hold them back from achieving what we like to call the American dream, from good health and prosperity?
You want me to start?
Sure.
I'd be happy to. Thank you very much for the question. Our equity action plan addresses and recognizes what many of us already know, that where you live, or conversely, if you have nowhere to live, and that is a growing population in this country, impacts nearly every part of our lives, whether it be our schools that our children attend, the jobs that we have access to, the health care we receive, and the air we breathe, just by where we live. And so we are focused not only on how we address what is happening in neighborhoods, but importantly, how we address homelessness. When we think about the disparity in homelessness, think about it in this way. The population of the United States is about 13% African American, but it's about 50% of the people who sleep on the streets of this country every day. And so our equity action plan is addressing how we deal with homelessness, how we address early in the stages of homelessness, things like pregnancy, children in schools, healthcare. We're doing assessments earlier, and we think that we're making a difference. And so with that, I would turn it to my colleague, Secretary Becerra.
So let me just add, and thank you for the question, Director Young, that for us, we know we had to do a couple of things. First, we had to change the paradigm where people had to come to us in order to get services. We decided we have to go to you because too many folks aren't fully aware of the kind of services and programs that are available to them. So we didn't want to wait. We went to you. And the other thing we realized is we had to collect better data so we would know where you are and who you are that need the help most. And so we established a Minority Health Social Vulnerability Index, which helps us collect data, better data, so good quality data, better collection methodology, so we could actually figure out where we needed to go rather than wait for you to come to us. Secondly, by having better data, we could do a couple of things. Vaccines, a year ago today, by the way, we know that vaccines are killing people of color, Blacks, Latinos, Indigenous people at about 2 times the rate of white Americans. So on vaccines last year, we saw that about 2/3 of white American adults had received at least 1 shot of the vaccine. That was just barely over 50% for Black Americans and Latinos at that particular time. So again, we've got to work. Today, a year later, over 80% of white American adults have received at least 1 shot. Over 80% of Black American adults have received at least 1 shot. Over 80% of Latino Americans have received at least 1 vaccine shot. That's because we went to you and we had better data to tell us. Same time, President Biden made a commitment. We're going to get more people insured so they have access to healthcare and the peace of mind that comes from knowing you can take your child to the hospital and not go bankrupt. What did we find? Well, too many folks in our communities were not getting the care they needed because they weren't getting the insurance they could afford. We went to work. I can tell you that after a successful enrollment period for the Affordable Care Act, where we broke records, we now have 14.5 million Americans who've signed up for health insurance and have peace of mind because of the Affordable Care Act. Well, within that, 35% more Black Americans signed up for a healthcare policy under the Affordable Care Act than just last year. 25% more Latinos signed up for a healthcare plan than did last year. We went to you, we got the good data. That's how you reach people.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to turn to Secretary Haaland and Secretary Vilsack to talk a bit about how your agency equity plans are addressing the needs of rural and tribal communities, which are central to our mission to advance equity for everybody who's been underserved. So let me begin with Secretary Haaland and then, I'll start with Secretary Vilsack and then to Secretary Haaland, please.
All right. Thanks, Senator Ambassador. Well, first of all, the key here for rural communities is making sure that they know about our programs. For example, the great bipartisan infrastructure bill that President Biden led us to finally getting done. A lot of communities do not know and do not appreciate what may be in that bill for them. So it's really important for us to get the message out about that infrastructure bill as well as the American Rescue Plan. And part of that is providing technical assistance, making sure that people who are trusted are giving individuals in rural communities information. It's also necessary for us to take the benefits of the American Rescue Plan and the infrastructure plan to try to provide innovative solutions. We know, for example, in terms of minority producers, that land access and market access are really, really significant challenges. So we're looking at ways in which we can expand local and regional food systems to create new market opportunities. We're looking for creative ways to provide land access. We're expanding processing capacity with the resources under the American Rescue Plan, all designed to create those opportunities for minority producers. I think it's also necessary for us to understand that sometimes communities cannot make the match requirement that many of our grant programs require. So, for example, in our Reconnect program, we basically set aside $350 million for no match opportunities for tribal areas in an effort to try to respond to that concern. The last thing I would say is that sometimes you also have to make sure that you're allowing folks to compete on a level playing field. Far too often, the way we judge applications for grants is based on a point system. If you don't have the points, you don't get the grant. we're leveling the playing field by providing some additional points for areas that have been persistently poor so that they can compete in a more effective basis. And finally, it really takes leadership. Obviously, the President and Vice President's direction to us really allows us to encourage our mission areas to focus on this issue of equity and making sure that people have access to our programs.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Secretary Haaland?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rice. And of course, we love working with Secretary Vilsack and the USDA. We appreciate his efforts and those of our team to reach rural communities and ensure that they're included in our collaborative conservation efforts. In fact, I just returned from Colorado, where we highlighted how infrastructure investments in fire mitigation and prevention from President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law will make a transformative and lasting impact on rural communities. When it comes to tribal communities at Interior, we believe that honoring our relationship with tribes and upholding the trust responsibility is paramount to fulfilling our department's mission. And that means valuing and respecting Indigenous knowledge to create a more sustainable future, ensuring Indigenous leadership has a seat at the table to make decisions early on about their communities, making strong investments through the President's bipartisan infrastructure law and proposed budget, and giving Indigenous people opportunities to rise above the challenges that our people face and to build a brighter future for all of our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. I am so proud to be part of this administration, proud to work alongside these amazing cabinet secretaries, and know that it takes that everyone takes this responsibility seriously every day. Susan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, very much.
All right, let's turn to Administrator Guzman and Secretary Raimondo. One key focus of these equity action plans is on building wealth and economic power for communities of color and other underserved communities. The federal government has enormous purchasing power and the ability to address barriers that families face in building intergenerational wealth. You both covered some of this, but can you drill down further on what your agencies are doing to focus on building wealth for communities that have been locked out of the opportunity to do this for generations? If we could start with Administrator Guzman.
Thank you so much, Director Young. Government procurement, I agree, is where we can put the power of the federal spend to work to advance equity. America's small business industrial base has been declining for more than a decade, with small businesses doing federal contracting dropping by more than 40%, but then new entrants were down more than 60%. And we know from SBA's recently released disaggregated data analysis that small businesses owned by people of color are underrepresented in contracting. So, with the President's leadership, all buying federal agencies are working together to build equity in procurement so that more small, disadvantaged businesses can do business with the world's largest buyer, the U.S. government. Federal agencies are now required to track and publicly report how they're bringing in new contractors. Executive performance metrics with the agencies for small business goals for socioeconomic firms, which include women, veterans, and socially and economically disadvantaged businesses, are now being tracked. And that includes, of course, those small disadvantaged businesses for which the President committed to increasing to the goal to 15% by 2025. With a first-year goal of 11% that agencies are well on their way with, that SBA has had the pleasure of negotiating with all of them. As I mentioned, SBA is reporting disaggregated federal contracting data for the first time, tracking by race and ethnicity. Means we can better track contracting disparities, and we'll continue to focus on how we can make improvements and use it to inform decisions. We've also collectively reformed category management so that small businesses can better access those large bundled contract opportunities, which we know are so challenging. As the agency responsible for directing the federal contracting goals, you should all know that how committed all the agencies are to these goals. especially considering the president's $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure law spend and the commitments of this administration to equity. That is going to go a long way to ensure that we can reverse some of those trends in small business contracting and bring in new contractors and focus on equity. And we know it's going to take quite a bit of support. The SBA has, of course, its network of business opportunity specialists across the nation at our district offices that focus specifically on helping more small businesses through the certification process, learning how to use SAM.gov, or leveraging our experts with intel on contract opportunities, with our procurement center representatives and our commercial market representatives that actually track contracts at the subcontracting level as well to make sure small businesses can participate. And so we're looking forward to this impact and all the agencies collectively making a difference.
Thank you. Secretary Raimondo?
Thank you. By the way, I couldn't ask for a better partner in this work than Administrator Guzman. We're working very closely on this, and I'm grateful for your leadership. So similar to the SBA, we're focused on growing small businesses across the country because most Americans work in small businesses, and it is the way to build wealth for individuals, families, and communities. So, and we have a lot of work to do. In 2019, the gap in business ownership between Black and Latino households relative to white households accounted for 25% of the overall racial wealth gap. So if we could greatly enhance and improve the ability of people of color to create and sustain small businesses, we could eliminate a quarter of the overall racial wealth gap, which would be pretty incredible. And eliminating that persistent racial wealth gap is obviously critical to achieving the long overdue promise of equity and equal opportunity for all Americans. So here at the Commerce Department, as I said earlier, the MBDA, Minority Business Development Agency, is very focused on this. And we are expanding support for procurement in new and existing business centers to ensure that MBEs can actually benefit from the federal government's investments. As Isabel said, it can be hard. It can be hard to do business with us. It's, you need a lot of assistance, technical expertise. Shalanda, no one knows better than you. Sometimes it's a bit too much paperwork, and it's hard for small businesses who don't have a big staff. And so that's why at MBDA, we're very focused on helping and supporting MBEs to know when to apply, how to apply, what their financial statements need to look like in order for them to be eligible and successful. Additionally, in helping with that technical assistance for MBEs for federal procurement, we're also assisting them to increase their exports. As I said earlier, we know companies that export are more profitable, faster growing, and actually quite a bit less likely to go bankrupt. So here at the Commerce Department, we're focused on expanding export assistance to small and medium-sized companies in underserved communities. In this regard, the Commerce Department is well positioned. We have over 100 domestic export offices with dedicated trade professionals to provide market intelligence, counseling, advice, services, technical support to help broaden the export horizons of small businesses. And not surprisingly, women, minority-owned businesses have fallen behind in this. And so we are very eager to prioritize this work so that we can, again, close the equity gap. The last quick thing I'll mention is also at the Department of Commerce, through our Economic Development Administration, we are very focused with our ARP money on place-based economic development, money in the community, and we are prioritizing transformational investments in rural communities, communities of color, and geographies that have been historically and systematically denied an opportunity to participate in economic prosperity. So we hope that taken together, all of this work at the Commerce Department will really help ensure that our small businesses, particularly those in underserved communities, have access to the support that they need and deserve, frankly, to survive and thrive.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Let me close by reiterating our thanks to all of you, all of our secretaries, for your inspiring and historic work that your agencies are undertaking to advance equity and racial justice. The President's commitment to building a cabinet that is historically diverse and truly looks like America is evident in the ways that you and your life stories and personal experiences impact how you're delivering for the American people. The actions that your agencies are taking are just the tip of the iceberg of the hundreds of new strategies that agencies have announced today to advance equity across the whole of the federal government. I hope those of you who are watching have learned a good deal about the great work that all of you and our colleagues who aren't able to be with us today are spearheading, and to learn more in great detail about the work of the federal government to advance the President's whole of government equity EO, I urge you to go to whitehouse.gov/equity. And there you will see in great detail all that our more than 90 agencies are doing. So please stay tuned also for our next panel with national equity advocates and leaders. It'll be a very interesting discussion. And thank you again to all of our secretaries for your extraordinary leadership. And thank you, Shalonda Young, my friend and colleague at the Office of Management and Budget.